I'm happiest in the saddle.
A fellow sportsman.
I am an FBI agent!
Great Scott!
What do you say we cut the chit-chat? A-hole!
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
Come with me if you want to live.
Hello, and welcome to Retro Ramble. I'm Charlie McGee.
I'm George McGee.
And this time, dear Ramblers, we are joined by Em from Verbal Diorama. Hello, Em. How are you doing?
Hello.
Great to have you finally on the podcast. Been a fan of yours for a while, and obviously we've met through the podcasting scene. I mean, it's safe to say you're a podcaster. You also do stuff for the Film Stories website, and I want to say you're a champion of independent podcasters as well. But we'll get into that.
I mean, yeah, that is all true. Maybe not so much a champion, but the rest of it is true.
Strong feelings about independent podcasts. We'll limit it there. But Charlie, what are we here to discuss?
Well, we are very much an independent podcast, and this time we are going all the way back to Retro Ramble. Who framed Roger Rabbit? Finally, we're going to answer that question. And I know that this is a film that's dear to everybody's hearts. Well, at least all three of us. And we're going to go around the usual places. So how do we get this film? I know we're lucky to have Em. She's got some production stuff, just like George has. So it's going to be two people on the trip to Production Chat Island. I mean, we're going to get right into it. It's Robert Zemeckis. What's the year, George? I want
88.
Yeah, I was going to say hot off the heels. Some serious tropes of or senses of Back to the Future in this one. So let's get right into it. George, is there anything we need to warn our listeners about this film, about us, or just about Verbal Diorama? What are they getting themselves in for?
We'll do the usual disclaimer for potential first-time listeners. So Retro Ramble is an independent film podcast. So Charlie and I are brothers, and this podcast is all about us going back and revisiting the films of our youth, looking at what made them so great. You know, do they still hold up? Have they been turned into sequels, remade, spun off into a Netflix series? I say it's a light-hearted look back, but you may learn something. There's going to be some production trivia, sprinkled throughout. But most of all, we just aim to entertain. We want you to have a bit of fun, maybe learn something, and best of all, maybe be encouraged to go and check out these films again.
Speaking of that, while George cues up the trailer, Em, when did you watch this? Because it's been at least a week since I watched this, but it's still fresh in my head.
Oh, I actually watched it yesterday, so It's super fresh. But luckily, it's one of those movies that I watched so much as a child and so much as an adult as well, that I know it pretty well. There's not much about this movie that I can quote lines and stuff. It's ridiculous. But yeah, I love this movie. I think it's fantastic.
And okay, and that's it. That's the end of the episode. We've got your opinion there.
Oh, sorry. I get so enthusiastic, especially about coming on other podcasts. So I love coming on other podcasts, and thank you, by the way, for inviting me on, because we've been talking about this for some time. But I get so enthusiastic about it that my excitement levels kind of peak, and it's always quite funny because on my podcast, obviously, I talk to myself. So you can't really get excited talking to yourself, can you? It's a bit difficult. But when I talk to other people, it's like people see like a completely different side of me, because I'm always like, excuse the pun, so animated about movies like this, because they are just, I mean, this one in particular, is such a technically brilliant movie anyway. But it's also just fantastic, and I'm just so happy to be here. Can you tell?
Wonderful. Right. Well, we'll get into it. Let's get going.
Let's go.
This is the tale of an up-and-coming movie star named Roger Rabbit. and a down-and-out private detective
Stay out!
named Eddie Valiant.
Ooga booga!
Every moment they were together was a new adventure in trouble.
Hide me, Eddie! Please!
It's a motion picture about friendship.
Take it easy! Please, Eddie! Don't tell me you're making a big mistake!
Love. Compassion.
All right, I'm sorry I yanked your ears.
All the time you yanked my ears?
Murder.
Marvin Acme. The rabbit cacked him last night.
Remember, you never saw me.
Sex.
I'd do anything for my husband, Mr. Valiant. Anything.
And violence.
Tunes gets him every time.
You wouldn't have any idea where the rabbit might be?
Got a thing for rabbits, huh? The whole thing stinks like yesterday's diapers.
It's a comedy a little different from all the rest.
I'm a pig! I'm a tune!
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
But tell me, Eddie, is that a rabbit in your pocket or you're just happy to see me?
Touchstone Pictures and Steven Spielberg present a Robert Zemeckis film.
We tunes may act idiotic, but we're not stupid.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
So, George, before you're going to tell us how we get this film, please tell us not only a little about yourself and Verbal Diorama, but lead that into what's been your relationship with this film? What does this film mean to you?
Well, I guess I'm not very good at selling myself. I'm rubbish. Verbal Diorama is a film history podcast. So I've always been fascinated with the making of films, pretty much ever since I was a kid and I saw Jurassic Park, because it's like, oh my God, there are dinosaurs on the screen. This is amazing. And I've kind of had this kind of love of trivia, movie trivia, for many, many years. And when you go through a particularly traumatic or stressful period in your life, you tend to start podcasting and it tends to be very good therapy. Obviously, please get professional help. Please see a therapist. I did see a therapist as well, by the way. But what I took from podcasting was it really kind of helped me kind of find myself at a time when I didn't really know who I was anymore. And I started Verbal Diorama over 5 years ago now. And that's kind of branched out a little bit for me. Obviously, I do that. As you mentioned at the start, I write for Film Stories as well. I've been a regular columnist in the magazine. So I've been doing that for 41 issues. And I talk about being an independent podcaster in the Film Stories magazine. The editor, Simon Brew, is a very good friend of mine. And he has basically supported me in my podcasting journey pretty much since I emailed him once upon a time and was like, can I write for you, please? Because sometimes you ask someone to do something, if you can do something, and sometimes they say yes, which still blows my mind. Verbal Diorama is a complete passion project for me. It's something that I love to do. And one of the things I love the most about what I do with Verbal Diorama is every year I do something called animation season. And every year it's January, February, I look at purely animated films. It's one of my biggest passions is basically championing animation, because I feel like it's a medium that not many film podcasts actually talk about, because I think there's still a stigma around animation. And one of the things I love leading into Roger Rabbit is this kind of hybrid mix of live action and animation is so unique. It's been often kind of attempted to be imitated. It's never been bettered. It's never been as good as this movie. And this movie is an absolute marvel of which we will never, ever see again. It is so totally special in every way, from the period setting to the animation style as well. The casting, Bob Hoskins, love him. He's my fave. But literally, and also the fact it's a very adult movie. It's a Touchstone label movie, but technically it is a Disney movie. And yeah, it covers some very a bit more grown-up subjects than most children would kind of enjoy. But when I was a kid, I just adored this movie. I didn't understand it. All I understood was that Judge Doom was the scariest character that I've ever seen in my life. Literal trauma. Even now, I can't watch Judge Doom, and I have to look away. It's ridiculous. You know, I'm a grown woman. I can't watch him.
Did you first discover this at the cinema, or was it on video, on TV?
When I was a kid, my uncle used to get us lots of Disney VHS tapes. So our house, we were just full of the Disney VHS tapes from the Disney Renaissance. That was the kind of the main period. And every time my uncle would come around my house, it would be to give me and my brother a new VHS tape. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit was one of those tapes.
Nice.
And it got played constantly. And obviously this was back in the day. I'm sure you'll both remember, because I believe we're probably of a similar-ish age. The days of VHS tapes where you played it, then you had to rewind it, and then forever. You played it again, and then you rewound it. And and it was like, if you hadn't rewound it, you then couldn't watch it straight away. You'd have to sit and wait for it to rewind before you could watch it. And it was the absolute worst. Kids don't know how good they have it with streaming. You can just start the movie. Millennial kids just didn't have that. Charlie and I've talked about VHS tape.
We don't think they're trying to explain to kids the whole concept of rewinding. They're like, what? No, that doesn't make sense. And it's like, yeah, you don't know how lucky you are. You've got everything at your fingertips. And on a similar note, like Charlie and I've talked about when we used to go and visit our grandmother, she had, I think, 3 Betamax tapes.
Five.
Was it a mighty 5? And they included, it was Star Trek 2, Wrath of Khan, and Tron are the only 2 I remember.
And there was Tom and Jerry. Tom and Jerry, and there was something else.
Was Care Bears, maybe?
Yeah. No, but you're right. It's like our grandpa Charlie. He's like, Betamax is going to win the battle. He was a real believer. But no, this whole Gen Z working things out thing. I said this at work the other day when I was trying to explain, like, my son, when I put on the football now, because it's the only time it happens, I put on, the Premiership, whatever. There's adverts, and I'm like, I'm going to pause it, and we'll come back. What is this? He's like, he's never seen an advert because of streaming. He's never had adverts, and as a result, he thinks they are amazing. Don't skip it.
It's a novelty.
Yeah. So there you go.
I think it's safe to say, I like to think you are one of the hardest working women in film podcasting, Em. You seem to be getting an episode, at least one episode out a week, and you cover everything. Unlike Charlie and I, we're quite picky. We're picking to a certain sort of era. You've talked about animation. You've done some horror I saw recently. You've done, you do a bit of everything. So I would recommend our listeners to check it. Verbal Diorama out. It's there's a lot of passion and a lot of trivia that would put me to shame. So yes, definitely check out Em's podcast.
On that note, what would be
Thank you. That's really kind.
What would be a good go-to episode for them to check out?
Well, do you know what? When because obviously I have been able to prepare for this, because when you've got over 250 episodes, that is kind of the question that people always ask. It's like, well, which one should I start with? And I'm like, I don't know. I've got lots of them. But, like George said, there is a wide variety of stuff. I do like to focus on animation for those 2 months, but generally it's pretty much any genre. I'm not particularly keen on horror. But I love like sci-fi. I've done like rom-coms, I've done musicals, I've done action adventure movies, dramas, all sorts of stuff. But one of my favorite things to talk about, and the things that I love to watch, is monster movies. I have such a huge admiration for Pacific Rim. That's not the movie I'm going to recommend, but just in the general kind of sphere of monster movies, I am the sort of person who will turn around and say that I absolutely love Pacific Rim. And so the episode that I actually am going to recommend is similar movie that was even more derided when it came out. And for that reason, and for that reason only, and obviously for the fact it has an incredible story behind it, it would be episode 211, which is on Godzilla 1998. Because it's not a Godzilla movie. Like, it's just not. I've done episodes on a Godzilla movie. I did Shin Godzilla just afterwards. And Shin Godzilla is genuinely one of the best Godzilla movies I've ever seen. And the US remake of Godzilla is just completely fascinating to me because it had such an incredible marketing campaign. And it's just like the movie was just like, nah, I'm not going to bother delivering. But here's a lizard like changing size randomly throughout the movie. And here's some, actually, let's not say his name because he's in the press recently for doing awful things. But a particular artist on the soundtrack, and Jamiroquai. Yeah, it's not a Godzilla movie.
Good soundtrack, though.
A lot of people don't realise. It's a great soundtrack. A lot of people don't realise because the character of Zilla, shall we say, is generally universally disliked by the Godzilla fandom. However, Toho signed off on that version of Godzilla. They legitimately said, yes, this is the Godzilla that we want in this American version of Godzilla. So the fact that all the fans are like, we hate it, it's not Godzilla. Well, technically, it kind of is Godzilla because they signed off because they basically had the rights to say no to this design, and they chose to say yes. But yeah, it's a fascinating movie. It's got a fascinating story behind it. And I feel like it's one of those movies that deserves a bit more love. So let's show a bit of love to the US remake of Godzilla.
Yes, no, I think that's one thing you're very good at on your podcast, whereas Charlie might make a bit more fun. And we know we're not, we know how much work goes into making a film. It's made by, it's not a solo effort. There's hundreds of people working on these films. But yes, we usually have a fun. I was listening to one of yours recently on another sort of big budget failure, Van Helsing, the Hugh Jackman. The first attempt to launch, the Dark Universe. And yeah, it's clear to say you always look for the positives, even if the film itself isn't that great.
Oh, absolutely. Because like you say, movie making is difficult. And I think we forget that because when you're just scrolling through Netflix and you're like, oh, I'll watch this dodgy Netflix movie. That dodgy Netflix movie is still got a huge cast and crew who are still committed to delivering the best possible product that they can. It may have a bad script, it may have a terrible cast or a bad director or whatever, but fundamentally no one sets out to make a bad movie. Even Tommy Wiseau thinks that his movies are great. So, and to be fair, The Room is a low-key masterpiece, but that is kind of the mantra of Verbal Diorama, is that let's celebrate movies. And I think from you guys and what you do, your points of view as well, you are also here to celebrate these movies as well. And I think that's what I like so much about you, is that, you'll have a bit of a laugh and a joke about it, but fundamentally, we're all here to celebrate movies at the end of the day.
Yes, we're all here to be entertained. Yes, we have yet to tackle 1998's Godzilla, the Roland Emmerich one. We've done Independence Day. We've done Jurassic Park, and I just remember the teaser trailer that's saying, "Oh, we're gonna wipe the floor with Jurassic Park," and yes, that didn't turn out very well. But yes, we'll get to it eventually. But shall we talk about Roger Rabbit?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I know you've both got probably some production or at least some trivia about this film. I think what's a great place to start with the film like this is, where were we when this film came out? Because not only have we got Christopher Lloyd, we've got Robert Zemeckis, we've got Steven Spielberg somewhere in the background.
Sprinkling his magic.
Sprinkling magic. Pixie dust on the film. But where were we in Hollywood? Because this film, which I think we should probably going to get into how long it took, but I'm just very interested to know where this film came from. The concept, the origin, what was this an idea? Because George has stories of this, maybe you do, Amber. Sometimes it's a story that's been kicking around Hollywood for years and never got made until the technology was available. I'd really like to know where the birth child of this was. Where did this idea come from? So,
well, this is something, it's an interesting time for Disney. And I think there's something that, feel free to jump in, but it was actually, it's strange to think, but the 80s, especially sort of the early mid 80s, where was a time when Disney was struggling. They were struggling. They tried to make a few live action films that hadn't performed well. So there was The Black Hole. I think there was like Pete's Dragon, and their animation studio wasn't doing very well. It wasn't really, we obviously, obviously I'm a little bit younger than you, Charlie, but we grew up in a time of the Disney animation renaissance that I think started with like Little Mermaid, but that was the end of the 80s with Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Lion King. And then obviously, Disney's now this behemoth, this huge thing that, incorporates Star Wars and the Muppets. But back in the 80s, I think they were struggling to find their feet in Hollywood anyway. They'd kind of lost that classical sheen from, all the classic features that they'd made. So yeah, they picked up Who Framed Roger Rabbit is based loosely based on a 1981 novel called Who Censored Roger Rabbit by Gary K. Wolfe. I haven't read the book, but I am told that it's quite different. It's more about censorship of comic strip characters, the Toons, and it's got that basic overview of Toons and real people coexist. But I believe Roger's killed off quite early on, and it's all about Eddie Valiant trying to solve his murder. Have you read? Are you more familiar with the novel than I am?
I am not familiar with the novel at all, but I do know a little bit, obviously, about the history of Roger Rabbit, because back in the day, this was a long time ago. It was like episode 4, so that's how long ago it was. I did an episode on Roger Rabbit. So I basically went back to that old episode and picked up some old notes, and I was like, oh, okay, if I'm asked, I'll just use these. Yeah, as I understand it, Roger comes back to life, but he's like a doppelganger. And the idea is that the two of them solve the murder together.
Right. So yeah, there's a bit of deviation there, but Disney thought there was something there to turn into an interesting live action feature. And they actually started doing some test footage in the early 80s with an animation director called Daryl Van Sitters. And they had an actor playing Eddie Valiant, and they'd animated Roger. And I'll go into coulda, woulda, shoulda, because it was someone quite famous who voiced Roger then. And I think they even went as far as putting out as like a coming soon feature on TV to sort of build up a bit of hype. And at this time, Robert Zemeckis caught wind of it and put himself forward. But at this time, this was pre-Back to the Future, and Zemeckis' films hadn't been that successful. I think it was like Used Cars and I Want to Hold Your Hand. And Disney were like, no, we're not that interested, sort of type thing. And it kind of languished for a bit. And then a key guy from Disney, Michael Eisner, he had moved over from Paramount and he was heading up Disney and he wanted to sort of shake things up. And whilst he'd been at Paramount, he'd been working with Spielberg on the Indiana Jones films. And he was keen to woo Spielberg over to Disney. And he basically offered him up Roger Rabbit. And Spielberg, for his huge love of classical animation, was keen to do it, but because he had a lot of sway, his contract included extensive creative control and a large percentage of the box office receipts, box office profits. But obviously, we've talked about this in Back to the Future. Spielberg's kind of protege was Robert Zemeckis, and by this point, he had made the smash hit Back to the Future and Romancing the Stone, which was a solid hit as well.
Yeah, Em, I mean, what would be your take on where this film sits in the Zemeckis Spielberg in terms of the films of theirs you've consumed?
I mean, I've consumed a lot of Spielberg. I mean, who hasn't? I just feel like he is like the definitive director of our generation and like future generations. Like it's like Spielberg, it feels like to me that Spielberg is always going to be there. And I know there's going to come a day where he's not, But it feels like ever since I was a kid, Spielberg's been there making movies. Like, and as I've grown up, well, Spielberg's still there making movies. I mean, for me, Robert Zemeckis' career, I feel like, has been on a little bit of a downturn of late, shall we say?
Yeah.
And I feel like, to me, he peaked with obviously the Back to the Future trilogy and with this. To me, these are the definitive Zemeckis movies. And I mean, I could quite happily watch any Back to the Future movie and this movie until the day I die. And it's quite funny if you think about the fact that how many pies Steven Spielberg had his finger in, so, throughout the 80s, but, how influential he was. The mere fact that the Spielberg name could get a movie made is quite a phenomenal amount of industry respect. And that's levels of respect that we don't see nowadays in directors. And the idea that Disney was floundering, no pun intended, in the 80s, it's one of those cautionary tales, I think, of when you are an animation studio, and Disney were obviously trying very hard to branch out into other things. When you have a situation where you've got people kind of coming in, different people managing the studio, different people, the studio's changing hands a lot. Roy E. Disney was in charge for a while, and then he was obviously removed from the company. And I feel like once that happened, it went a little bit too corporate. But I feel like in the 80s especially, it was very much a case of, we need to do everything we can. Let's do live action. Let's make animation on the cheap. Let's do these direct-to-DVD sequels, because obviously the VHS boom happened, and it was like, oh, we know how we can make more money. Let's put things in the Disney Vault and re-release them every so often. And that was something that obviously Disney did fairly regularly, re-releasing stuff in theaters or cinemas, shall we say. But they were so desperate in the 80s for something, like anything that was gonna revive them. And I feel like Roger Rabbit came along at exactly the right time, because although The Little Mermaid was obviously being worked on at the time, and The Little Mermaid changed their fortunes, I kind of feel like it was on the strength of Roger Rabbit, because Roger Rabbit really kind of set that new renaissance of animation going in a way that kind of no one expected. I mean, I was quite young in the 80s, so I don't really remember, but I feel like this movie came out of nowhere.
It's a weird one. It's I feel, I don't know if it's just my feeling, but I kind of feel like Back to the Future, when you're talking about Robert Zemeckis, Back to the Future overshadows this, which is weird, because I was telling someone about this when they said, "Oh, what's your next podcast?" And I said, "Oh, we're doing Roger Rabbit." It's like, "Oh, is that's Spielberg, isn't it?" It's like, well, it's yes, but it's actually Zemeckis, and it's a weird one that he has. Yeah, it's such a technically brilliant film, and he would go on to really, like, similar to James Cameron, trying to push technology in cinema, and probably not as successful as James Cameron. He obviously did the trying to do the motion capture stuff, and it just seemed to like lose a lot of heart. Whilst there's been a focus on technology, as you say, you do struggle. There's been the odd interesting film that he's done. Contact's brilliant. Flight, I think, is a great film. But yes, it seems, as you say, like he kind of sort of peaked with this. But going back to Spielberg, and I think talking about this film, that it's such a unique thing, and as you touched on earlier, that they'll never make anything like it again. And I think one of the things that with Spielberg coming to the project, he opened so many doors in terms of and it's something Charlie and I joke about, is the shared universe, the fact that you've got Disney and Warner Brothers and all these cartoon characters that everyone knows and loves all in the same film. And that just feels now like an impossibility. That if it's not, someone like Warner Brothers saying, "Oh yeah, we'll do Space Jam, but it's only with our own characters."
Excuse me, lawyer here.
Exactly. And it just feels like it's it's mind-blowing to see that Spielberg managed to convince them all to like play nice, and obviously there was apparently lawyers involved saying, well, if you're gonna have Daffy Duck and Donald Duck in the same scene, they have to have equal screen time. The same with Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. They had to have the same number of lines, and there's all these things being worked out. But it's such a, I know it's weird. You take it for granted as a kid watching it and just saying, "Oh yeah, that's of course they're all tunes. What, of course they'd be together." But it's now the kind of stuff of fan fiction.
But that's obviously the sort of thing. That's probably how Spielberg said it. It's like, it's not going to work unless we show that it's all of tunes. People aren't going to believe it.
Exactly, and you can see that there's so much like passion from Spielberg, and that's what's pushed it through. That the fact is that it's, the cartoons that him and Bob Zemeckis grew up with. It's like, yeah, we've got to do it, and we've got to do it like this, and it's got to have. Apparently, the one of the reasons they picked, big shout out to outside of Zemeckis and Spielberg, but is the animation director Richard Williams, and apparently they picked him because they said he was someone that could take it was an amalgamation of animation in terms of Disney's high quality of animation, Warner Brothers's characterization, and Tex Avery's humor, and it's making that work cohesively. And the thing that I realized watching this, I hadn't watched this probably for about a good, I'd say 5-10 years since the last time I watched it. Obviously, I watched it a lot as a kid, but as you said, a lot of it goes over your head. I forgot how sexual it is. Obviously, you've got Jessica Rabbit, but it's quite a grown-up story. It's a wacky toon film, but it's also part film noir as well. And being older, and now I've at the age where I've had the chance to watch some of the classic film noir, I can appreciate it even more.
Yeah, and I think that's the idea, that this like style of animation, this level of animation, these animated characters from all of the studios. It's not obviously just Warner Brothers and Disney. You've got Turner, Universal, Fleischer, Felix the Cat, all of that. One of the things that blows me away is that Spielberg's clout was so huge that they basically made this agreement for $5,000 per character. And you think now, like, you imagine DC and Marvel in a room with DC going, well, I'll give you Batman for $5,000 if you give me Iron Man. It just would never happen. They would never get in a room together. And for that reason alone, like that, this movie is a marvel. Excuse the pun. There we go. But the idea of someone like Richard Williams, I'm really glad you brought up Richard Williams, because I feel like he is the MVP of this movie. He's the silent MVP, because I don't know if either of you have seen The Thief and the Cobbler. It was an unreleased movie. You can find it on YouTube. There's basically this fan account that's going through restoring this work. It was basically completely unfinished. It was never released. It was kind of, but it was released completely cut to shreds with a different title and everything like that. But the animation, it's Richard Williams, and the animation, first of all, you'll pick up things from Roger Rabbit, it's very slight things from Roger Rabbit that you'll pick up in The Thief and the Cobbler. But honestly, it's some of the most breathtaking animation. It looks like it's 3D. He can basically animate, and it looks like the camera is basically turning in this staircase. It's absolutely stunning. And he was so dedicated to his art. And the idea that this movie uses Richard Williams as animation director blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind, because no one really knows him and knows his work except for this movie. So I feel like, as the perfect showcase for Richard Williams, Roger Rabbit is also a technical marvel, because he never really got much of a shot. Like his work never really kind of blew up. The Thief and the Cobbler was going to, ideally, if it was ever released, but it never was. But I would highly recommend, if you are interested in animation, check out The Thief and the Cobbler on YouTube. It will blow your mind, genuinely. But you know, this movie has so much going against it, if you think about it, that it's such a huge risk to have these characters, to have the idea of a Toontown, to have this quite grown up film noir kind of crime caper thing going on. It's, you know, kids don't care about, they're basically buying all these corporations, and the idea is that if you buy these corporations like the red car, then you can basically stop the red car from actually operating, so that people will use this freeway through Toontown and all of that sort of stuff. Kids don't care about that. I don't care about that. I'm a grown-ass woman. But the idea that this movie is so aimed at a family audience, and yet so not aimed at a family audience, that would never be made today. They obviously tried with the Chippendale. I don't know if you saw the Chippendale.
Yeah, I was going to say that kind of came out. Was it during the pandemic? I think it was the last time they tried it, and it was brilliantly done. I remember I was ill and just like bedbound. I was like, oh, I just fancy watching it, and I found it really like surprisingly funny. I mean, it's the guys who from like Lonely Island, isn't it? It's like Andy Samberg, and that lot. And I found it was really affectionate and very funny and clever, but that kind of sort of came and went. I suppose it didn't get a proper cinema release, and I just don't hear anyone really talking about it, which is a shame.
And it's a real shame, because it is it is a fun little movie, but it's nothing. It's trying to like be this, but it just can't be, because this is just such a huge risk, you know.
And I think that's one of the things I would encourage everyone to watch. I mean, if people do have a Disney Plus subscription, they've got in the extras when you go into the film on Disney Plus, they occasionally on Disney have the odd bit of extra. Sometimes it might just be the trailer, but on this, it's a half an hour making of Roger Rabbit. And I recommend, if you're a fan of this film, to check it out, because it's amazing, the technical wizardry that goes behind this film. Because I think when I was younger, I just kind of assumed, oh, well, they'll just draw in around it. And yes, that's a very simplistic way of putting it. But just in terms of all the stuff that they had to do to make it see, like, in terms of Bob Hoskins doing loads of mime training, and the fact that they had to build like robotics and contraptions. So there's that scene where Roger's like smashing plates over his head. They had this robot basically with like a hand picking up plates, and just the amount of technical wizardry. I say, Bob Zemeckis has obviously, done that throughout his career, but it's just so much you take for granted, because it's such a magical film that you just don't even, really stop to question it. How are they doing that?
The whole fourth wall breaking thing is nuts, and it's funny how it's part of the plot as well. But like, it's done so well, it took them so long to do it. It's the reason why we only have one of these films, but it's also the great thing about this film, and it's part of the plot.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up as well, just going back to the genius that is Richard Williams. If you look at the animated characters, you'll notice that the animated characters share the same light source as the human characters. So the animated characters are lit in exactly the same way as the human characters, as well as like obviously casting shadows and stuff like that. That is like a level of detail in animation that is kind of rarely seen, just generally in animation. Because like there's a scene with Jessica, who I love as a character, by the way. I think she's fantastic. She is over-sexualized, but as a character, as a female character, I think she's incredibly well drawn. She is drawn that way. But obviously her sparkly outfit, that was all done by hand as well, which is incredible. But in the scene with her in the club, the camera kind of pans around her a little bit as she's kind of doing something, she's kind of walking around Eddie Valiant, and the way that kind of the camera kind of pans around, and the light that there's a big huge spotlight that's shining down on her, and the way that she reacts to the light and the light reacts to her, it's just, honestly, this movie is technically amazing, but it's just the tiny little details that this movie does. This is a movie from 1988, and the technical details are all there. And I mean, Richard Williams is just, amazing. Genuinely, I'm so happy that you suggested that I come on for this movie, because I feel like not a lot of people talk about this movie enough for how incredible it is, how influential it is as well, despite nothing else coming after it. I still feel like it was incredibly influential in animation in the Disney canon.
From a technical marvel, they essentially had to film it twice, because there's the stuff that you were talking about in terms of trying to get the light source. They would have life-size puppets of the characters. So there'd be a life-size puppet, and you would have Bob Hoskins and puppeteers like for blocking and things like that. And then they'd say like, and they would act out the scene with the these puppets or models, and then get rid of them and film them with nothing there. And then I think there was a full year of post-production with, I've got over 82,000 panels of animation. And in terms of that lighting, to keep it faithful to traditional 2D animation, there was 4 layers of optical compositing before adding it to the live action. So yeah, it was just a phenomenal amount of work that went on when they'd finished filming. Because yeah, you're effectively making two films. There's the live action film, and then pretty much because there's an animated character in every scene or some sort of part of animation, you're making a fully animated film afterwards.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So I mean, we got this film. They started making it. They realized how long it was going to take, and then something you said that resonates with me is that I have not watched this film. I can say, I think it's probably been 20 years at least. But I watched it so much when I was younger that it all came screaming back to me. Like, I have this muscle memory, and you're like, oh yeah, and then he's gonna do this, and then he's gonna do that, and then you start going through this film. You're like, okay, but there's a bit where they're looking through the walls. It just starts coming back to me. But I don't know what you want to talk about in terms of what do you think I mean, we've talked about the technicality of this, but what are each of your highlights of this film, going back to it and watching it again, however recently? What is it that you are still so impressed by even today?
I mentioned him briefly, but Bob Hoskins.
Yeah.
Bob Hoskins is everything to this movie. He is so game for everything that they put him through. And the fact that, like we've already said, he was basically acting against nothing. Charles Fleischer was off camera, I think, delivering lines as Roger Rabbit, but otherwise he was acting against nothing. And he is so completely up for this movie. And I feel like it would be very easy to join a movie like this and kind of half-ass it, so to speak, and just be like, well, I'm not acting against anyone, so I can just deliver my lines however I want. You feel like Roger is there with him when he's talking to Roger, when he's interacting with Roger, when he's interacting with Jessica. They're not there, and you know that they're not there, but honest to God, this movie makes you believe. And that is the fundamental point of any movie, is to make us believe that these characters are real, this situation is real, this story is real. And Bob Hoskins delivers that. I feel like this movie would not work without Bob Hoskins. I'm just trying to, because I think I had somewhere in my notes who it was going to be.
Oh, we'll save that for coulda, woulda, shoulda.
You can have your moment when we get.
Okay, fine.
Coulda, woulda, shoulda. We'll cover that. We'll cover that. Don't worry.
Okay, yeah, I've got all sorts of notes, but fundamentally my point is that not only is he gruff and the pure emotion that he gives, when he's thinking about his recently deceased brother and he's going through the photographs of the holiday and you can see the tears in his eyes, and I'm like, this man can act. And then you kind of juxtapose that to the end when he's singing, Merry-Go-Round Broke Down, and he's fully physical and he's doing a little dance, and he's just, he's incredible and he's not praised enough. This and Super Mario Brothers, peak Bob Hoskins. And I mean that genuinely.
Yeah.
I love Super Mario Brothers, but he is giving this movie everything. And again, it's overlooked because of what this movie is, because it's a family movie, because it's got animation parts. A lot of people overlook it, but this is a truly outstanding performance by Bob Hoskins.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast on this recently, and they rightfully said that it's such a brilliant performance from Hoskins that it's a crime that he wasn't even nominated. I don't believe he was nominated for like an Oscar or anything, but it's such a, as you say, it just makes it seem like seamless. The amount of training he's done and the believability in it. But yeah, in terms of the partnership, for me watching it this time round, I forgot how funny Roger played Charles Fleischer. I forgot how funny he is as Roger.
Yeah.
It's such a brilliant performance. And just one final bit of trivia that he was so like him and Bob Hoskins would rehearse together, but like before filming. But he was so dedicated to the role. He got Bob Zemeckis to make him a full-size Roger Rabbit costume. So even if he's just off to the side of camera, like feeding the lines to Bob Hoskins, he was still dressed like a rabbit. And like Bob Hoskins was like, "Why are you doing this, Charlie? What, you're not even in the bloody film." And he's like, it's dedication to the craft, Bob. And he goes, but Bob Hoskins reacted to it because he could, he was in his eye line and he was basically, inspiring him on.
Yeah, I think the only two things I'd like to mention are the two scenes that stick in my head. I don't know about you guys, obviously watching this back in the day. Even now, and I think it's probably because of some of its technical brilliance, there's the handcuff washing the dishes scene with the weasels.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's the final scene with the whole, what we talked about, the Judge Doom, whatever thing, which we can get to. But those are the two scenes that stick in my head. But that scene that you're talking about, all of his craft, everything that we've been talking about up until now, the things they tried out, and then obviously the fact they had to film it and they had to superimpose. But that scene is so difficult. You've got the water. He's got to keep putting something in the water. He's got characters walking around him. The lighting is everywhere. The cameras are everywhere. That's a great scene. And I think that was the go-to clip that they would show when they were pruning it, because that's how we learned about films back in the day.
Yeah, because I think it's one of those, like mixing live action and animated is like, it wasn't a new thing. Obviously, it goes back to, I think, Mary Poppins is one of the earliest forms. That's a Disney film, right?
Correct.
This, it was like the characters would appear like completely flat, or would have the human live action characters superimposed, dancing with penguins and what have you. But as you're saying, that scene there, that whole bit of like the cameras moving around, and I think that's something that Richard Williams wanted, was like in animation the camera can be very static, but he wanted it moving around to really essentially break the rules of animation. And yeah, there's so many bits. There's the bit in the speakeasy room where they're trying to like saw the handcuffs and the light swinging and everything. It's just phenomenal. And yeah, again, it's something I say I haven't watched this that often, but it just watching it again reminds me how brilliant a film it is, and I look forward to introducing my kids to it as well, because I think there is, like, whilst there's a lot of wacky stuff, there's a lot of more adult stuff. I think there's enough cartoony stuff that the kids, I think I must have been 5 when this came out the cinema.
But I am now using patty cake as my go-to. What are they doing? Patty cake. They're doing patty cake.
Brilliant.
It works.
I think we've covered everything on the film. I would say, so I think originally it was due to be released as a Disney film, but because Bob Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg had complete creative control and pushed for stuff like the overly sexualized character of Jessica Rabbit, because when Disney were testing it in the early 80s, she was a much more of a traditional film noir femme fatale. But because it was so sexualized, Michael Eisner was like, we can't release this as a Disney movie. So that's why it's under their more adult Touchstone banner. But shall we get into, we touched on it before, shall we get into some coulda, woulda, shoulda?
Absolutely.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So, coulda, woulda, shoulda is where George enlightens us onto the, or in this case, potentially the actors or directors who were considered for roles, but for whatever reason did not get their chance. So, who wants to go first? Coulda, woulda, shoulda. I think the ladies first. Guest has to go first, George.
But of course,
Sorry.
No. If George has got his stuff, I've got some stuff in front of me, but I don't want to take the shine away from George. So you go for it, George.
Well, I know there's a lot of people that were considered, and sometimes with these things on the internet, you have to take with a pinch of salt. But as far as I can gather, I have 4 for Eddie Valiant. The first being Harrison Ford, who apparently was too expensive for the budget. I think we haven't touched on this, but it was for a very short time the most expensive film ever made, this film, and the budget did I think it was at 70 million in the end, or between 50 and 70, which feels very small in these days. But yes, Harrison Ford was too expensive. Apparently Bill Murray was offered it. But Bill Murray, I don't know if you've heard this. Bill Murray's method of receiving jobs is that people call up a number and they leave it as an answer phone message, and then he decides whether he wants to take the job and rings them back. He never answers his phone. So, but apparently he completely missed the message that they left for him, and he was gutted that he missed it.
Oh wow.
I think he'd be good. A good shout. Paul Newman, apparently his name comes up, I think, in the making of features.
No. Just gonna say no, Bob Hoskins, no thanks.
And then very left field, but his star was very much on the rise at this point. None other than Eddie Murphy, and Eddie Murphy turned it down because he just thought there was too many things that could go wrong, the mix of live action and animation and the technical expertise. He was like, oh, sounds like too much of a risk. And obviously, this is round about the time that I say he was huge. This was, I think, Coming to America was the same year. So he was at the peak of his stardom. But Em, have you got any more for Eddie Valiant?
No, I haven't got any more for Eddie Valiant.
For Judge Doom, touching back on one of our more recent episodes, Charlie, we had none other than Tim Curry for Judge Doom, who Bob Zemeckis said was too scary. And Zinj. And considering how terrifying, we've briefly touched on Christopher Lloyd, but considering how terrifying Judge Doom is in this, part of me thinks, how much more scary can you get than what we got? I mean, I think for me, just going back to Christopher Lloyd, I think growing up, I felt it as such a juxtaposition against his lovely character in Back to the Future. It's just like, why is he playing this horror, scary man?
Yeah, a grandfather who would take care of you in whatever timeline you're living in to your ultimate nightmare.
I mean, there's the bit, even I was watching it with my wife, and even the bit where he gets steamrolled, and she was like, oh, I forgot how creepy this bit is. It is
creepy. It is a creepy film. For me, I like looking back at this era. We've talked about the Jessica Rabbit, we talked about the adult themes, but I was thinking about this earlier. It's like, there's certain films I want to show my children. No, I just remember there's a scene. Back then, there were just things they would throw in a kid's film, something for the adults. It's fine.
Yeah.
That would never, and Disney balked a little bit at it. And I think we've become more straight-laced these days. Like, it's like, it's either column A or column B. It's like, we're not having any middle of the road. We're not throwing any adult jokes for the parents in the room. It's like, it's a kid's movie. It's for a certain age group. And I think that's probably because of certification.
Yeah. And then finally on Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda, for director, apparently Terry Gilliam was offered the chance to direct it early on, but he found the project too technically challenging. He said, in hindsight, pure laziness on my part. I I completely regret that decision. So yes, that could have been a very different film with Terry Gilliam at the helm.
Okay. Anything else you want to contribute? Is there any other things you know about people who were considered for Roger Rabbit, maybe wanted to be in the sequel or had ideas, but it never happened? Anything you've heard?
No, to be honest. I mean, they were basically all of the people that I was aware of. But to be honest, I feel like they chose correctly. I was going to say non-poorly.
Yeah.
They chose correctly with Bob Hoskins. Harrison Ford could not have done this. Eddie Murphy, probably he would have been funny, but could he have done the really serious stuff?
Yeah.
The thing is,
no. Yeah.
I was going to say with Bob Hoskins, you kind of can imagine him in a straight-laced film noir. You can see him as the down on his luck detective. And again, that's something that like went over my head as a kid, like how much of an alcoholic he is in this. You know, he's like literally like licking his lips when he sees a bottle. But yeah, it's he feels, even though I would say it's still like occasionally his accent does slip occasionally. It's a brilliant performance, but you do get a bit of Cockney Bob slipping out occasionally. I think it's just mainly when he goes ooga booga.
Ooga booga.
But I don't know what your notes have on this, but do you know much about the sort of, they tried to do a prequel, and there was at one point they were planning a prequel and or a sequel to this?
Yeah, so what there was the Toon Platoon.
Yes. So
that was the prequel.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was another one as well. Who Discovered Roger Rabbit?
Yeah, so there's a brilliant podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar, The Best Movies Never Made, and they interviewed one of the screenwriters that worked with Spielberg on some sequel ideas, and I think it was like, you know, hot off the success of Roger Rabbit. I mean, Roger Rabbit was the second biggest, highest grossing film of 1988, so I think they were quite quick to get back in the writers' room and say, okay, what ideas can we come up with? And yeah, one of the ideas, as you said, was a prequel. It was going to be Toon Platoon, and it was going to be about Roger and friends in World War II. And the other sequel idea, I think, was going to be about, prequel idea was about an agent, a down on his luck agent, discovering Roger. And in both films, the human counterpart was going to be none other than Tom Cruise. Apparently, that Spielberg was like, yeah, I want you to come up with ideas. Tom Cruise is the star, and what can you come up with? And for whatever reason, neither of those films materialized. But Spielberg was just like saying at one point, imagine how amazing it would be for the Toon Platoon one to see Tom Cruise piloting a cartoon airplane, you know, in World War II. But I think by the time they got into a bit further into development, by this point, Spielberg had made Schindler's List. And for him, he's like, I can't make fun of World War II after doing that film. So that was shelved. And I think just due to the strain on everyone, like looking at the behind the scenes features, everyone loved working on it, was completely broken by it. And I feel like they're like, I don't want to do that again. I love that movie, but I don't want to do it again.
No more.
Yeah, and I think as well, we've touched on the cost of this movie. It was an incredibly expensive movie. And if you imagine any sequel or prequel, the cost of that, especially when you take into account inflation, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And the original was a risk. And no studio, not even Disney, is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a sequel. Not when they're not guaranteed that it's going to be a success.
Well, no, it's funny. Charlie and I were just chatting in our last Patreon episode. We were talking about how some of the biggest flops of last year, out of the top five biggest flops, 4 of them were Disney films. And the fact is they're investing so much into these films. They're spending so much on marketing, and the box office isn't just what it used to be, you know. And Disney are kind of partly a cause of that. The fact that they're releasing these films, you know, is it 8 weeks or something, 10 weeks after they've been at the cinema. But yeah, no, my wife actually said that to me when we were watching it together. She said, I'm surprised Disney haven't tried to like do anything with this like recently. And if you look at, you know, there has been revivals like, you know, they tried to do the Willow series and things like that. But I think, you know, for the reasons that we covered, because the technical aspect involved, because it's so risque, if they did try and do it now, it would be a lot watered down and you certainly wouldn't get those rights to all those different characters. So
yes,
it does feel very much
100%.
like. So yeah, Charlie, I'm wary that I've been doing a lot of talking. Is there anything else you want to add on Roger Rabbit?
No, I mean, for me, I just, as I say, a lot of muscle memory, remembering a lot of things. Pretty sure that tunnel that features that goes through the Toontown is the tunnel from Back to the Future.
What I've watched funny enough, my daughter is just getting into Back to the Future at the moment, and we've recently watched Back to the Future 2. And so within the same week, I'd watched Back to the Future 2 and this, and I'm just like, yeah, that's definitely the same tunnel.
I mean,
and obviously we haven't talked about Alan Silvestri and his amazing, you know, we joke about Alan Silvestri having, you know, his scores are very similar.
But also quite jarring, because
yes,
you could argue, say, oh, look, it's another Oscar-worthy title. And guess who's doing music? It's Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
But when you get down to Silvestri and you realize it's like, okay, it could be, I'm hearing those notes, it could be Back to the Future.
Could be Predator.
It could be Predator. So, you know, it's like very, what's the other one? And obviously...
Ominous. He does ominous quite well.
Yeah, but it's the fact he's got the same Predator. Is that what are you watching? It sounds like Predator. No, it's Back to the Future. They are very similar.
But then obviously in this, there's a lot more jovial stuff as well.
I do love. I know we talked about animation at the beginning. I think we've talked about a lot of the behind the camera animation. Also, just love the animation in this film. I love how it's used. I love how much it's used. I love the for its time. Obviously, today. Comedy animation has to be so tongue-in-cheek, has to be so clever, has to be so funny, and they were doing that, I think, very well. You know, I think for its time, it's right up there in some of the best animation you'll see. Still able to give the look and feel of what you want to see, but do it in a funny way, in a new way, an original way, and as Em mentioned about the lighting. So yeah, nothing else to add really about this film. Fantastic voice acting, obviously the time that it's taken, the budget that it's taken, and I think we all understand now why they never made a follow-up sequel just because of it. I feel like we've covered the spin-offs. George and I have the feature Suspicious spin-offs, where we talk about, you know, if you could remake it today, if money was no object, what would you like to see? I don't know. Do you feel like we've answered that question, Em, or do you want to give it a go? Like if you could have your perfect follow-up Roger Rabbit film coming out, let's say 2026, because you've got to get your crew together, what would it be?
Mm-hmm. Do you know what? This was the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm regretting it now. But I want to know more about Nina Hyena. I feel like she is a character that we need to know a bit more about. I thought maybe we could have like some animated Nina Hyena dating show whereby she has all these suitors, and she just, because obviously she really wants a man. Clearly she is after Eddie Valiant.
Is this the lady that Eddie Valiant mistakes for Jessica Rabbit? A man.
Nina.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think she's wonderful. And the fact that he can like tear up a portion of road and like put it into a wall and she will just smack into a wall. She is like the perfect tune. And I think reality TV shows are really hot right now. Let's make an animated reality TV show about the dating exploits of Nina Hyena. Nice.
Do it. Make it happen. Charlie, there was one bit of trivia that I need to surprise you with because it ties in. It's a name that comes up a lot in our podcast, but there's a little bit of an in-joke in this movie right at the start. The opening cartoon, and you get the angry producer who's shouting at Roger Rabbit.
That's not meant to be Joel Silver, is it?
That is Joel Silver. So
Okay.
as a little in joke, they hired Joel Silver, and apparently I think he doesn't get on with Michael Eisner from Disney, so they kept it sort of under wraps. But it was it's you want an angry producer, we'll give you an angry producer. So yes, that's none other than Joel Silver playing him, well, a version of himself.
But Joel Silver, the angry producer who has produced some of the best films
of all time.
Of all
yeah,
time.
As we've touched on.
Just don't work with him unless you really have to.
Finish up, we've got some quick fire questions. First one, we've talked about him, but what is your favorite Spielberg movie and why?
I mean, this is like the worst question that you can ask a millennial, but I do have an answer. And that answer is and always will be Jurassic Park. It was such a seminal movie for me growing up. It's the movie that made me love movies. It's the movie that made me curious about movies and how movies were made. And I just think it's awesome. And it holds up incredibly well. The reason why it holds up is because they are animatronic dinosaurs for the most part. And I think a lot of people forget that now because the CG was revolutionary at the time. But I think people think there's more CG in that movie than there actually is because the animatronics are so good. But no, the majority of them are animatronics. And it's like Spielberg is a fascinating director because he made the ultimate monster movie in Jaws, which everyone knows the stories of Jaws. He had problems with the shark because the shark was underwater and the water got in. And then it was like, oh, actually, it's 1993. I'm going to make another monster movie, and I'm going to have these huge monsters, and I'm going to use a lot of rain to hide the visual effects. And of course, the dinosaurs just soaked up all of the water and made them incredibly heavy. I love the fact that Spielberg is a sort of director who's not put off by previous experience. He will just do it all again. Enough said about the Lost World, the better, I suppose. But always Jurassic Park. It's a phenomenal movie. It's incredible filmmaking. And Ellie Sattler is one of the greatest female heroines to ever be put to screen, as far as I'm concerned.
Very good choice. Very solid choice. What is your favorite 80s or 90s movie soundtrack and why?
I mean, again, it's like the 80s and the 90s soundtracks. I mean, this is like Sophie's Choice, you know? It's like there's so many incredible ones out there. But I had to pick the first one that, similar to Nina Hyena, I had to pick the first thing that came to my mind, and that was Dirty Dancing. And I think Dirty Dancing is just an incredible soundtrack. And despite the fact that, you know, it is very much based sort of in that 60s era, apart from I've Had the Time of My Life, which is obviously played at every wedding and every birthday party till the end of time. But the rest of the soundtrack is so good. And that movie is so much better than a lot of people give it credit for as well. Mostly because of Patrick Swayze's character. I think he's got a fascinating character arc in that movie. And a lot of people just go, oh, well, it's a sexy dancing movie. But it's actually a lot more nuanced. And the soundtrack's incredible.
We covered that. That film holds a special place in our hearts. And we actually covered that. We had our sister Sophia as a guest on that because it was one of her, you know, when we think of that film, we think of enjoying it with her, listening to the soundtrack on repeat. Charlie you were on a school trip and they basically had, was it 2 cassettes, Charlie? One was Dirty Dancing. What was the other one?
Top Gun.
Top Gun. What a choice, those two soundtracks.
Nice.
And they are the correct 2 answers to that question George just asked you. So congratulations.
So you passed the test. I think I know the answer to this one, and you can probably we'll see anyway. Who is the best John? Is it John Matrix from Commando, Johnny Utah, Point Break, John McClane, Die Hard, or Johnny Five, Short Circuit?
I mean, he is a man very much well known for playing characters called John. He plays a lot of characters called John. But the only answer I could possibly give, despite my love for Commando, grew up watching that movie with my dad. it would have to be Utah, and I would also have to append that with "Get Me Too," because of the famous line in Point Break. And yeah, any mention of Keanu Reeves will always be very welcome for me. So yeah, but he plays a lot of Johns and Johnnies.
He does.
So
he does. Yeah, there's Johnny Mnemonic.
He's clearly got an affinity to yep.
Yeah,
John Constantine, John Wick.
Yeah.
It's
safe to say, am I right in thinking you have a feature on your podcast about tenuous links to Keanu Reeves?
Yeah, well, it's called the obligatory Keanu reference, and
right.
I basically task myself every episode to find a link to Keanu and the movie that I'm featuring. Sometimes that's really easy because you can kind of say, oh, well, you know, Keanu was in a movie with Winona Ryder in this, you know, whatever. You can usually find a link. Sometimes they're incredibly difficult, and sometimes they can be very tenuous, because it's like trying to find links to something like, well, Shakespeare in Love was quite easy, actually, because obviously Keanu has been in a Shakespeare adaptation. But some of them are incredibly tough. And in the past, I've said I don't want to replicate them, but I've started to do that now because I'm like running out. But yeah, I try to do it every episode. Sometimes I forget, especially with the double episodes that I'm doing at the moment. It's like, how do I link Keanu to Clash of the Titans? He's a titan of cinema. I don't know.
So recent Clash the Titans would have Sam Worthington, right? Who's been in Terminator.
Yes.
Terminator has been with what's he called? The guy who shouted on the set.
Christian Bale.
Right, and Christian Bale has been in. I think that's the way I would go.
You would go with new Clash, but old Clash, I think, would be a challenge.
But it's basically let's play six degrees of
Keanu.
Or Keanu. So that could be a good feature. Keanu. But we love him. We love him too, very much.
We do love Keanu, and we've featured quite a few of his films.
Who doesn't love Keanu?
He's very lovable.
What's wrong with you?
So 2 more questions, I realize we've been recording for a while, so we'll wrap these up. But
sure.
It's a tough choice. Are you watching Alien or Aliens?
It is a tough choice, but I would always go Aliens. I love Alien. I think it's incredible. And I love the story behind the making of Alien. But to me, Aliens is slightly better, I think, because it's just I like sci-fi action movies, and Sigourney Weaver is just such a complete badass in that movie, and I love it. So yeah, it's got to be Aliens.
Again, you've passed the test.
Correct.
We'll allow that. And finally, you're on death row. What's your final meal, your drink, and your movie of choice before you exit this world?
And who you with?
Keanu Reeves, obviously.
Keanu Reeves, obviously. My last meal's mac and cheese, because who doesn't love mac and cheese? It's the best. I'm really into this particular drink at the minute. So it's a soft drink, but it's the San Pellegrino Limonata. I think they're lovely. Just beautiful, kind of slightly sour, sparkling lemon drink. Perfection. And my movie choice is always The Mummy, the one from 1999. It is the greatest movie ever made. You'll notice behind me, I
was going to say,
obviously listeners won't see this.
Yeah.
My original VHS copy of The Mummy sits pride of place. Genuinely adore the movie. I've been on lots of podcasts talking about it because I love it so much. Yeah, it is genuinely the greatest movie ever made. So, and then I'll die very happy.
Nice.
So why not?
Well, we are due to cover that. We've got that because it's 25 years this year, isn't it? The Mummy. So yeah, we're going to be featuring it on coming soon to Retro Ramble.
Yeah, a very wise choice on being fully carved up for the afterlife. There, you never know. You don't know what's coming. But yeah, the Mummy was one of my first ever. You know, you always remember your first 5 DVDs, and it was right up there. It was very much the DVD time. Okay, I've not got much else I need or want to say about Roger Rabbit. Either of you two, anything else you want to get off your chest? Any pet hates? Anything we've forgotten to say? Should say?
think we've covered everything on Roger Rabbit. My final question to Em would be, what have you got coming up on Verbal Diorama? Is there anything else you want to plug whilst you're here with us?
Sure. What have I got coming next? Well, I mean, as of recording this week, I've got a double episode on the original Italian Job, the 1969 Italian Job, and the 2003 remake of the Italian Job. That was interesting because I'd never seen the original Italian Job before.
Oh, right.
I'd only ever seen the remake, so watching that was, it was incredible. I'm a huge fan of practical stunts, and that movie is just like a dream for me with all the driving stunts. And such a fun story behind it as well. Basically, on Verbal Diorama, like I say, I'm so passionate about the making of films and the stories behind the scenes, and I try and obviously find stories that people don't know. That's sometimes a bit difficult, especially with quite big movies. A lot of people tend to know, but I'm really proud of that episode. And then at the moment, I'm working on. So I'm doing this remake season at the minute. This week I'm working on West Side Story, so the original 1961 musical and the 2021 remake, which is also kind of incredible because also another Spielberg movie as well, just to get it back into Spielberg.
Of course.
Spielberg always wanted to make a musical, and he made West Side Story, and it's a very, very good musical, but it's just such an incredible thing to talk about, the fact that you've got obviously the original stage musical from 1957, which was then adapted into the 1961 movie. And then 60 years later, they made the remake with Rita Moreno in it. You know, she's in her 90s and she is still just as incredible as she was back then. She is a legend. And I'm so excited to talk about her. After that, I've got a couple of fun episodes after that, actually. I've got Knives Out, which I think is going to be really fun. And I'm finally going into something with a large fan base. I tend to avoid very large fan bases. I've not really done anything Star Wars. I've done Rogue One, but that's kind of very separate to everything. And I thought to myself, do you know what? I've never done a Star Trek movie. So I'm doing the original 1979 Star Trek, the motion picture.
Oh, wow.
Which is going to be fun. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So that's got what I've got coming up. And have I got anything to plug? I mean, listen to my podcast. That's it. That's my plug. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I asked you about, so you have you've been a champion of independent podcasts. You've given us a nice shout out on Film Stories in the past, but you are one of the organizers of the Independent Podcast Awards. Is that coming up? Is that again? It was the first year last year.
Yes. So it was the first year last year. That was basically a very random conversation that happened to turn into this lovely little awards ceremony. It was one of my better ideas. I'm very proud to say that was one of my better ideas. But I'm the co-creator. I wouldn't say I'm the organizer because I'm working with the fantastic team at Why Now, and they are doing all of the organizing. They are incredible. But obviously last year I helped them out with some bits and pieces. I was on we had like an independent podcasting board to obviously help shape the awards, because we always said from the very beginning that it was kind of, by podcasters by indie podcasters. Let me make that clear. Indie podcasters for indie podcasters. So we actually had a board of independent podcasters to kind of help shape the categories and all of that. And it was very much kind of, everyone was very hands-on with it. It wasn't just one person making all the decisions. And yeah, so we did that. I was a judge as well, which was a wonderful experience to kind of listen to all these incredible podcasts. And honestly, it was one of those things that kind of blew my mind a little bit, because I know, because I've written features for Film Stories on podcasts, I don't really do it anymore, but I did it for several years. And I know that the quality of podcasts that's out there, just purely based from that. But I was actually blown away by all of the other categories of podcasting. And just the genuine, incredible quality that indie podcasters are putting out. It's amazing. It's awe-inspiring, you know, and it kind of made everything worth it in a way, because I spent a lot of time judging all of these different podcasts and kind of picking up new podcasts to listen to at the same time. And I still listen to some of them today. And honestly, the quality out there is incredible. Independent podcasting has never been better. And in a way, I feel like we needed an event like this to shine a spotlight on independent podcasting, even though, you know, these podcasts, we're not saying they're not good enough to go for the BPAs or any other awards. But personally, I kind of thought it was important that independent podcasters could kind of compete with their peers more in a way. And it was just an incredible experience. The night was incredible. I met some amazing people. Yeah, we're going to be doing it all again. So the ceremony is in October of this year, and the judging concludes in, we're judging in July and August. So people should find out if they're nominated in September. Right. And yeah, it's just a wonderful thing to be a part of. And genuinely, the best people are in indie podcasting. And I'm not just saying that because I am, and I'm not just saying that because you guys are. I'm saying that because I know that for a fact. Because I've seen all of the incredible people in indie podcasting that I've worked with sort of for this event. And it's a wonderful feeling to know that everyone is kind of out there doing the same thing, wanting to get the same thing out of it. And fundamentally, it is a community. And, you know, I feel that, you know, deep in my bones, that this is an incredible community of people, and we're all there for each other. Sorry, exactly. I can talk a lot.
No, it's great to get your insight about the awards, and, you know, we'll be sure to include a link to that in the notes. As you say, I think the whole independent community needs to prop itself up, you know, and the awards is one way of doing that. Us sharing each other's content is another way of doing that, and us raising awareness of all the other great independent podcasts out there is another way of doing that. George, is there anything else we need to mention before we all sign off and go back to our other walks of life?
No. As I say, I think we've got a few big films coming up. One of them will be, I think we're covering The Mummy as a summer release, so later on in the summer. But yes, thanks again to Em for joining us. Thank you for all the work that you're doing for the independent podcast community. You know, love your podcast, love the stuff at Film Stories. So it's been great to have you on.
Well, thank you, George. Thank you, Charlie. It's been an absolute joy to be here talking to you about Roger Rabbit. I could genuinely talk about that movie for another 2 hours. However, we've all got beds to go to. So
Indeed.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, for this episode, I've been Charlie McGee.
I've been George McGee.
And I've been Em from Verbal Diorama. Available in your podcast apps.
Wonderful. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.